Welcome to Twilight Fables, where we open the door to the places old tales never wanted you to see. Tonight's story begins with a gift meant to bring joy, but joy has a way of rotting if you hold it too close. This is Thumbelina, the seed eater. Marla's house stood on the last bend before the road dissolved into the marsh. From a distance, it looked less like a dwelling and more like something the earth had been trying to swallow for decades. The walls bowed inward in places, as though the wind had been pressing on them year after year. The roof was quilted with moss, and the chimney leaned like an exhausted traveller. Most days, the only sound inside was the faint tap of water dripping somewhere in the rafters, and the occasional groan of old wood adjusting to the cold. The hearth was cold more often than warm. The bed felt larger every winter. In the bedroom, against the wall that caught the morning light, sat a crib. It was covered with a white sheet to keep the dust off. Marla could see the outline of its carved posts through the fabric. She had polished the wood once a month for years, rubbing beeswax into it until it shone, though no small hands had ever clung to its rails. Marla had wanted a child since she was 15. Not a vague, whimsical wish, but a deep, marrow-level need. She had prayed for it, knelt so long on the cold chapel stone that her knees bruised. She had swallowed foul herbal tonics until her tongue went numb. She had tried charms and superstitions, burying a silver spoon under the apple tree, sleeping with sprigs of basil under her pillow, placing a white candle in her window every night for a year without fail. Every month came and went. The apple tree died. The candle burned down. Her prayers turned into mutterings she didn't bother to finish. The crib stayed empty. One damp market morning in late autumn, she found herself walking the row of stalls without really knowing why. The fog was heavy, clinging to her hair and lashes in beads that made the world shimmer faintly. Most stalls were shuttered. The sellers had given in to the cold weeks ago. She was about to turn back when she saw smoke. It curled upward from the far end of the square, thin and strangely straight, as if it knew exactly where it was going. She followed it until the outlines of a stall took shape in the fog. A stall she had never seen before. It was built from willow poles, the bark still clinging to them, bound together with dark strips of something fibrous that looked unsettlingly like dried sinew. Bundles of herbs dangled from the roof: marigold, foxglove, bleeding heart, each tied with a red string that had darkened with age. The smell here was dense, floral sweetness at first, but with an undercurrent of something damp and earthy, like the air in a cellar where the light never reached. On the table sat rows of glass jars. Each contained a single seed. Some were no larger than grains of sand, others the size of a plumpet. A few were suspended in clear liquid, others nestled in black soil. A few of them moved slowly, subtly, as if breathing. The woman behind the table did not look up when Marla approached. Her hair was silver, braided tightly, and her skin was like thin parchment, drawn over the bones of her face. Her hands moved over the jars with a slow precision, as though each touch was part of a ritual. "You've been waiting," the woman said, her voice low and oddly warm. There was a texture beneath it, a faint crackle like dry leaves. Marla blinked. "For what?" "For the thing you want most," the woman said. "The thing you can't speak of without your voice breaking." Marla's mouth went dry. She tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "You must have me mistaken," the woman smiled. "Not kindly, not cruelly, knowingly. You want a child. You've wanted one long enough for the world to notice." Marla's fingers tightened inside her sleeves. "That's not something you can give." The woman reached under the table and brought up the smallest jar Marla had ever seen. Inside, nestled in soil so black it seemed to drink the light, lay a seed no larger than a pearl. Its skin was pale gold, faintly veined, and when Marla leaned close, she swore she saw the veins pulse, once, twice, in time with her own heartbeat. "It will grow," the herbalist murmured, "into exactly what your heart craves, but you must plant it in the vessel where you keep your hope." "How much?" Marla whispered. The woman's smile deepened. "Hope is payment enough." Marla didn't remember paying. She didn't remember the walk home. She only knew she was suddenly in her kitchen, the jar warm in her hands, the seed pressing faintly against the glass, as if it were alive and restless. She searched the cupboard until she found the right pot. Clay, chipped at the rim, once used for basil before it withered in frost. She filled it with her richest soil, though it smelled faintly of mildew from the damp, and pressed a small hollow in the centre. The seed slid in easily. She covered it with earth and set the pot on the windowsill, where the morning light would reach it. From that moment, she treated the pot as though it were already a child. She gave it exactly 1 spoonful of water each dawn. She spoke to it as she worked, about the weather, about her errands, about nothing at all. She found herself standing by it without realizing, fingertips resting on the rim, listening for something. On the 3rd morning, a green shoot pierced the soil. By evening, 2 small leaves had unfolded, heart-shaped and glistening. By the 4th day, the stem had thickened, and Marla could swear it leaned toward her voice. By the 5th, a bud formed, small at first, but swelling visibly as she watched. Sometimes, at night, she thought she heard it, faint clicks and pops like knuckles being flexed. By the 7th morning, the air was heavy with scent. It wasn't the sweetness of roses, nor the freshness of meadow blooms. This was thicker, almost cloying, with a hint of rot beneath, like fruit left too long in a warm cellar. She went to the window. The bud had opened. Its petals were pale gold, fine as skin, their veins catching the light. Inside, curled as though asleep, was a girl no taller than Marla's thumb, Her hair was golden silk. Her skin seemed lit from within. Marla's breath caught. She reached out and touched the tiny arm. It was warm. The girl stirred, opened green eyes like deep moss, and smiled. "My child," Marla whispered. "My little one." She named her Thumbelina. Days passed in a haze of joy. Marla made her a bed from a walnut shell, lined with cotton pulled from an old shift. She stitched dresses from flower petals, sewing with spider silk until the seams gleamed. Thumbelina's laughter was like water over smooth stones. She danced on the kitchen table, leaving tiny wet prints that dried in moments. She sang in a language Marla didn't know, high notes that made the window glass quiver. But as Thumbelina thrived, Marla began to fade. Her mornings felt heavy. Her hands trembled when she tried to work. Her skin took on a pale, waxy hue. At night, she woke feeling parched, her heartbeat slow. She told herself it was the damp weather, but there was another feeling she couldn't explain, as though something was drawing from her steadily, a constant, gentle pull. Then one night, she woke to a sound. At first, it was soft, like the whisper of fabric on wood, but it came from the table where Thumbelina's walnut bed sat. Moonlight spilled through the window, silvering the shell. Thumbelina was sitting up, her blanket fallen to her waist. Her hair tumbled over her shoulders, catching the light. From beneath the hem of her dress, something dark and glistening slipped over the edge of the shell. A thin green tendril, no thicker than a thread. It moved slowly, purposefully. Another tendril followed, then another, writhing like the roots of a plant. Searching for water, they slid to the floor, curling and uncurling until they reached the leg of Marla's bed. She tried to pull her legs up, but her body felt heavy, pinned. The first tendril touched her ankle, warm, almost gentle. Then it wrapped around her with the slow patience of ivy climbing a wall. Thumbelina turned her head toward her. Her eyes were not bright and innocent now. They were deep, dark green, ancient, in a way no child's eyes should be. She smiled. The morning light seeped weakly through the thin curtains, casting a pale wash over Marla's worn wooden floorboards. The chill of dawn crept under the doorframe, and the faint scent of damp earth clung to the air. A smell that had settled in her home ever since the seed had sprouted. Marla lay still in her bed, eyes closed against the weight of memories from the night before. The tendrils that had slipped out from under Thumbelina's delicate gown haunted her thoughts, their slow, deliberate movement like ivy, creeping to claim her. The grip on her ankle, a cold, persistent pull that had left a spiral bruise, faint but unmistakable. But there was no time for fear, not now. She finally exhaled, the breath hitching in her throat, as she turned to see the tiny figure curled within the walnut shell, fast asleep. Thumbelina's breathing was so soft, so fragile. The golden strands of her hair spilled over the edge like liquid sunlight. Marla's hands trembled as she reached out to touch her child's cheek. The skin was warm and smooth, impossibly delicate for something so small, but beneath the surface, Marla felt an unnatural pulse, steady, insistent, something that didn't belong to a human heart. The days that followed passed like slow waves against the shore, each one pressing more heavily against Marla's senses. She became obsessively attentive to Thumbelina's needs, treating her like a fragile treasure, but also sensing the strange power coiling beneath the child's radiant skin. The plant in the pot had transformed beyond recognition. It was no longer just a seedling. It had grown long vines that crept over the windowsill, their tips curling like fingers, reaching out for warmth and light. Dark pods hung from the tendrils, swollen and pulsing faintly in the dim kitchen light. The scent that seeped from the plant was heavier now, sweet, but with a bitter undertone, like rotting fruit left too long in a cellar. Neighbours stopped coming by. Some whispered as they passed, casting sidelong glances at Marla's crumbling home. Whispers about changelings and curses, but Marla was deaf to it all. All that mattered was the tiny being sleeping in her palm. One evening, as a cold wind rattled the window panes, a strange sound drifted from the marsh beyond the yard. At first, it was barely audible, a deep, throaty croak that rose and fell like a slow heartbeat. Then came others, answering in rasping calls that echoed between the reeds and water. Marla stiffened. She had heard frogs in the marsh before, but never like this, never with such cadence, such deliberate purpose. Her heart thudded in her chest as she moved toward the window. Moonlight silvered the glass and painted ghostly reflections on the rippling water. From the darkness, two enormous, bulbous eyes stared back at her. The head of a massive toad rose from the water, glistening and slick under the moon's pale gaze. The creature's wide mouth opened, and to Marla's horror, it spoke. "Bring her to me," it croaked, its voice low and unyielding. Marla's blood ran cold. "Who? What are you?" she whispered, clutching Thumbelina tightly. The toad's throat swelled with each breath. "She belongs to me. She was promised long ago." Marla shook her head, panic tightening her chest. "No, she's mine." The creature's eyes narrowed. "Before you were born, before your mother's bones crumbled to dust, this bargain was struck. That seed was not a gift. It was a debt." Marla's fingers dug into the rough fabric of her dress. "I don't owe you anything." "You do," the toad croaked. "She feeds on you, your warmth, your life. But one day she will outgrow what you can give." Thumbelina stirred in her walnut shell, lifting her tiny head. Her green eyes, once bright with childish innocence, now shimmered with something older, something dark. The toad's voice dropped to a whisper that filled the room like mist. "You will bring her to me, or you will feed her until nothing remains." Marla staggered back, the weight of the threat settling over her like a shroud. That night, she bolted the shutters and stayed awake, holding Thumbelina close, but sleep refused her. Shadows lengthened and twisted. The house groaned as if alive. She heard faint scratching near the floorboards, like something trying to move beneath the house. The air thickened with the scent of the marsh, damp, fetid, ancient. In the dawn's first light, Marla caught a glimpse of the bruise on her ankle again, a spiral of green that pulsed faintly as though alive. She washed the mark, but it only deepened. Each day her strength waned. Her reflection in the cracked mirror was gaunt and hollow-eyed, yet Thumbelina thrived, her laughter tinkling like fragile bells, her voice echoing in a language Marla could not understand. The toad's croak haunted the edges of her mind, a constant refrain. One evening, Marla ventured out to the marsh's edge, clutching a lantern and Thumbelina's walnut shell. The water was still, silvered under a crescent moon. The toad surfaced again, larger and more menacing. "Tonight," it said, "the tide rises. Bring her or lose yourself." Marla's heart shattered. She looked down at the child sleeping peacefully in the shell. "I won't," she whispered. "I can't." The toad's eyes gleamed. "Then you will feed her until you are nothing but a husk." Marla returned home, the cold seeping into her bones. The vines from the plant had crept into the floorboards, wrapping the house in green fingers. That night she dreamed of the toad's dark eyes and Thumbelina's growing hunger. The day bled slowly into dusk, its light waning beneath heavy clouds that stretched low over the marsh. Marla stood at the window, fingers pressed to the cold glass, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the water met the sky in a bleak, endless line. The scent of brine and decay drifted through the cracked panes, carried on a wind sharp and relentless. It seeped into the room, wrapping around her like a shroud. Behind her, the soft sound of Thumbelina's breathing wove through the silence, so small, so delicate, so achingly human, and yet so impossibly other. Marla had barely slept in days. The bruise on her ankle had grown darker, its green spiral pulsing faintly as if alive. Her hands trembled with exhaustion, but she dared not rest. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch and twist, whispering secrets she couldn't quite catch. The creeping vines from the plant had spread across the floorboards, tendrils slithering like serpents toward the hearth. The air was thick with the scent of rot and honey, sweetness laced with decay. Outside, the marsh was alive with sound. Deep croaks echoed across the water, layered and haunting. The toad's summons, a call older than the trees, older than the stones buried beneath the earth. Marla's breath caught in her throat. She clutched the walnut shell where Thumbelina lay sleeping, her small chest rising and falling with each fragile breath. The child stirred, opening her green eyes that glinted with a strange, eerie light. Marla's heart tightened as those eyes met hers, ancient eyes filled with a hunger that chilled her to the bone. As darkness swallowed the last of the day, a heavy knock thundered at the door. Marla's pulse quickened. The knocking came again, slow and deliberate. She crossed the room, heart pounding, and pulled the heavy wooden bolt across the door. But the knocking persisted, now joined by a wet scraping sound beneath the floorboards. From the corner of the room, the plant's vines twisted and writhed, inching closer. A cold draught swept through the room as the door creaked open. The toad stepped inside, massive and glistening, its eyes gleaming with a merciless light. Water spilled in behind it, pooling on the floor and soaking the worn rugs. "You cannot hide," the toad croaked, voice rumbling like distant thunder. "You promised." Marla pressed Thumbelina close, trembling. "She is mine," Marla whispered, voice cracking. The toad's mouth curled into a grin that was all teeth and darkness. "She belongs to the marsh, to me." The toad's tongue flicked out, tasting the air between them. Marla felt the cold seep into her bones, an icy pull tightening around her heart. The bruises on her skin seemed to burn. Thumbelina slipped from Marla's grasp, her small feet touching the water that now covered the floor. She turned to her mother, a smile on her lips. Serene, terrifying. "I will come back," she whispered, "when I am ready." Then she stepped toward the toad. The room faded as the marsh reclaimed its child. Marla stood alone, soaked and trembling. The vines curled tighter around the hearth. Her reflection in the water was gaunt, hollow. The toad's promise hung heavy in the damp air. Marla was left to wait, to hope, to feed the hunger growing inside. The dawn crept in reluctantly, as if the morning itself was wary of what had begun. The sky outside was a muted grey, heavy with clouds that threatened rain, but never quite let go. Inside the house, the air felt thick and heavy, laden with a scent that was both sweet and sour, like damp earth mingled with forgotten flowers. Marla woke slowly, her body weighed down by exhaustion and something deeper, more insidious. The bruise on her ankle, that spiral mark, the colour of moss and bruised leaves, pulsed faintly beneath her skin. She flexed her toes, feeling the cold bite of the floorboards beneath her feet. But the floor was no longer as solid as it had been. Something moved beneath it. Sitting up, Marla scanned the room, her eyes drawn immediately to the walls. They no longer stood silent and still. Green tendrils twisted up the plaster, curling like the fingers of a sleeping giant, awakening from a long slumber. Tiny buds blossomed sporadically along these vines, their petals pale and translucent, like they were carved from moonlight itself. The vines shimmered faintly, as if breathing with a life of their own. The pot that had held the golden seed was empty now, but from the corner of the room, a creeping green web stretched outwards. It wound itself around the furniture legs, coiling like serpents in a slow, deliberate dance. Marla's heart thudded painfully in her chest. With trembling fingers, she reached out to touch one of the buds. The petals were cool and smooth, unnervingly perfect, and as she brushed them, a whisper floated into her ear, soft, indecipherable, like a secret carried on the wind. Her breath caught. The house was alive, not just with the rotting timbers and creaking beams of age, but with something new, something growing, something hungry. Marla rose unsteadily and made her way to the hearth, where a small fire still smouldered from the night before. The warmth did little to ease the chill that had settled in her bones. She glanced down at the walnut shell cradling Thumbelina. The child lay curled inside, her golden hair a halo around her delicate face. But there was a new weight in those tiny green eyes, a knowing far beyond her years, an ancient hunger that seemed to draw from the very air around her. "Mother," the child whispered, voice like a sigh of wind through leaves. Marla felt a shiver run through her. She wasn't sure if it was fear or sorrow or something else entirely. The days blurred. Marla moved through them like a ghost, her skin growing paler, almost translucent. The veins under her hands stood out dark and swollen, like roots just beneath the earth's surface. The vines continued their relentless spread. They curled over the windowsills, slithered along the ceilings, and wound themselves beneath the floorboards. The house seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, a slow heartbeat that matched her own fading pulse. Marla's dreams were plagued with strange visions of marshes flooded with golden light, of voices calling her name from beneath the mud, of Thumbelina's face shifting between child and something else, something otherworldly. Sometimes she would wake to find herself in a different room, the house rearranged in impossible ways, hallways that stretched longer, doors that led nowhere, windows looking out onto endless water and sky. One evening, as twilight bled into night, Marla sat by the fire clutching the walnut shell. She had begun to hear the whispering voices clearly now, not just in dreams, but waking moments too. They came from the walls, the floor, the air itself, a chorus of soft voices chanting in a language she almost understood, a song as old as the marsh. "Come to us," they called. "Come to the roots. The bloom is waiting." She pressed her fingers to her ears, trying to shut out the sound, but it only grew louder, more insistent. The vines around her began to move, wrapping gently around her wrists and ankles, not cruelly, but with a terrible tenderness. That night, Marla dreamed of the bloom. It was vast and impossible, petals like stained glass windows, glowing with an eerie golden light. Inside, curled tight, was Thumbelina, no longer a child, but a creature of the marsh itself. Her eyes gleamed like deep forest pools, filled with sorrow and hunger. "Mother," the bloom whispered, "you gave me life, now I give you mine." Marla reached out to touch the petals, but they closed around her fingers like jaws. She woke with a start, sweat soaking her sheets. The house had changed overnight. The floor was soft and springy beneath her feet, as if walking on moss rather than wood. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the scent of flowers and decay. Marla's reflection in the cracked mirror was strange and shifting. Her skin paler than ever, eyes darker, shadows gathering beneath them like storm clouds. She could no longer tell where she ended and the house began. In the days that followed, the vines grew thicker, their grip tighter. They wrapped around her limbs, coiling slowly up her arms and legs. Their touch was cold and firm, like stone. She felt their hunger, not just for light and water, but for her. The seed she had planted was no longer a seed, but a root, growing deep inside her flesh. The villagers stopped coming altogether. The path to her house was overgrown, swallowed by weeds and marsh grass. From her window, Marla could see only the endless grey marsh, stretching out like a wound beneath a stormy sky. She was alone, and the house was hungry. One night, beneath a sickle moon, Marla followed the whispers to the heart of the house. There, the great bloom had opened wide. Its petals were vast and shimmering, translucent as glass. Inside, Thumbelina waited, no longer a child, but a being of impossible beauty and terrible hunger. Her eyes locked with Marla's, full of sorrow and a terrible promise. "Mother," she said softly, "the bloom takes root." The vines pulled Marla closer, wrapping her in their cold embrace. She closed her eyes and felt the last of her strength slip away. The house claimed her, body and soul, and the bloom whispered its terrible lullaby. The marsh waited. The seed was sown. The house no longer felt like a refuge, but a prison, an ancient and living thing that pulsed with a dark, creeping life beneath the surface. Marla awoke to the thick, damp air that clung to her skin like a second layer, heavy with the scent of moss, earth, and decay. The sunlight filtered weakly through the grimy windows, casting sickly patterns of green and gold across the warped floorboards. She shifted in bed, feeling the cold bite of the floor beneath her feet, despite the threadbare rug. The bruises on her ankles throbbed in slow, painful rhythms, their deep spirals now darkening toward black. She flexed her fingers, noticing how pale and thin her skin had become, translucent in places, like parchment stretched too tightly over brittle bones. Her reflection caught in a cracked shard of glass nearby, gaunt cheeks hollowed with exhaustion. dark shadows pooling beneath her sunken eyes. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. She tried to recall the last time she had felt truly rested, the memories blurred with the days, stretching into nights and back again, all swallowed by the house's slow, suffocating hunger. Outside, the marsh lay silent, mist curling like ghostly fingers over the water's glassy surface. The wind whispered secrets among the reeds, carrying with it the faint echo of croaks and calls that no longer seemed to belong to any earthly creature. Marla sat on the edge of her bed, the small walnut shell cradled in her trembling hands. Thumbelina's tiny face, framed by shimmering golden hair, looked up at her, but the eyes, those deep moss-green eyes, seemed to hold a secret, a sorrowful knowledge far beyond innocence. A soft voice, barely above a whisper, brushed her ear. "Mother." Marla's heart clenched painfully. She rose and moved to the window, staring out into the grey dawn. The vines had crept farther since yesterday, now threading along the window frame and curling up the cracked walls like fingers seeking warmth. Each day the house changed more, a slow metamorphosis that seeped into every corner. The floorboards warped and softened, creaking softly underfoot, like a beast breathing in its sleep. The walls pulsed faintly, shimmering with veins of green light beneath the plaster. The blossoms that bloomed along the vines were no longer delicate buds, but large, fleshy flowers that opened and closed with a slow, breathing rhythm. Their petals were translucent and veined, the edges tinged with a sickly gold that pulsed with eerie light. Marla reached out instinctively, brushing her fingers along one. It quivered under her touch, the petals parting slightly to reveal a tiny face curled within, a face that resembled Thumbelina's, but twisted and otherworldly. She recoiled, breath catching in her throat. Her nights grew darker. Sleep came in fragmented shards, filled with visions that bled between dreams and waking. She wandered endless halls that stretched and twisted impossibly, walls dripping with sap and flesh, shadows dancing like living things. She heard laughter, sweet, haunting, and childlike, echoing from deep within the house's bowels. And always the voice is calling, "Come to us, mother." The root awaits, the bruises had spread. Wherever the vines touched her skin, dark spirals bloomed, pulsing faintly like sick veins beneath the surface. Marla could feel the roots spreading inside her, twisting and growing deep beneath her flesh. It was a slow, creeping poison, one that sapped her strength and filled her with an impossible hunger. Not her hunger, but the seeds. Marla forced herself to the hearth, trying to light a fire. The matches hissed and died. The wood was damp and soft. The warmth she remembered from before was gone, replaced by a cold dampness that seeped into her bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the chill. Outside, The marsh was restless, the water rippled, reflecting the sickly yellow moonlight, and the air vibrated with the toad's deep croaks. Marla shuddered. One evening, the whispering grew louder. She could no longer tell where her own thoughts ended and the voices began. They seeped into her mind, weaving dreams and memories into a single, unbearable thread. In those moments, she felt Thumbelina's presence most keenly. No longer the fragile child, but a creature of the marsh, a bloom of the root itself. Her daughter's voice was both a lullaby and a curse. "Mother," she said, "soon we will be one." The vines tightened. Marla found herself unable to leave the house, trapped by the living walls that pulsed and breathed. She felt them creeping beneath her skin, slow tendrils wrapping around her heart and mind. The root claimed her. One night, in a fevered haze, Marla stumbled into the great hall at the house's centre. There stood the bloom, immense and impossible, petals shimmering like stained glass, veined with golden light. Inside, curled tight, was Thumbelina. Her eyes shone with sorrow and terrible hunger. She reached out a hand. "Come," she whispered. Marla took a step forward, then another. The vines surged, pulling her closer, their cold embrace wrapping tighter. Her breath faltered, her vision blurred. She was no longer Marla. She was root and earth, blossom and bone. She was the hunger beneath the soil. The bloom closed. The house exhaled. The marsh waited, patient and endless. The night outside pressed thick and heavy against the fragile walls of the house. A dense fog rolled across the marsh, swallowing the distant silhouettes of reeds and trees, like ghosts drifting in a half-forgotten dream. Inside, the air was suffused with a peculiar warmth, unnatural and close, as if the house itself was breathing, alive with slow, deliberate pulses that rippled through the walls and floorboards. Marla lay awake on a rough-hewn wooden bench, the dampness of the house seeping through her thin clothes and chilling her to the bone. Her breath came shallow, her heartbeat erratic, echoing the slow but relentless rhythm that seemed to throb beneath the very ground. She felt it in her bones, the bloom's pulse, the seed she had once planted, now grown into something vast and terrible. She reached toward the small window, wiping the condensation away with a trembling hand. The marsh stretched out beyond, vast and dark, its surface broken only by faint ripples and the occasional flash of eyes watching from the shadows. The house had become more than stone and timber. It had become a vessel for the bloom, a cradle for the twisted promise that had taken root in her life. Every day, the vines crept farther, their fleshy petals breathing in the gloom, their edges shimmering with a sickly golden light. The flowers pulsed softly, alive with an eerie heartbeat, that matched her own fading pulse. Marla's fingers brushed the edge of the walnut shell resting beside her, the fragile cradle where Thumbelina had once slept. Now, that child was no longer the innocent girl she remembered. She was a creature of the marsh, her skin gleaming faintly like wet leaves, her eyes deep pools of moss and shadow. The voices whispered again, a chorus rising from the roots beneath the floorboards, not cruel or threatening, but patient, ancient, persistent, inviting. Mother, they sang, join us beneath the rocky earth. The bloom is ready. Marla forced herself upright, every movement a struggle against the weight dragging her down. The bruise on her ankle throbbed fiercely, the spiralling mark darkening as if alive. The vines, which had been creeping silently, now clung to her legs and arms, cold and firm like marble, binding her gently but inexorably. She shivered, but the chill was not from the cold. It was the bloom's hunger, reaching deeper inside her, drawing her closer. The days and nights blurred together. Time lost meaning in the house that had become a living organism, breathing and growing in slow, terrible rhythms. Marla wandered the twisting halls, now lined with moss and blooming flowers, whose petals fluttered faintly like the wings of moths. Her reflection, when she caught it in the cracked mirror, was strange and alien. Pale skin stretched thin over bones that seemed to throb with root-like veins, eyes sunken, yet shining with an eerie light. The hunger inside her had settled into a steady burn, no longer agony, but purpose. She felt the bloom's promise coursing through her, a promise of life beyond death, of beauty forged from decay, of a hunger that could never be sated but must be fed. One evening, as the moon hung low and full in the sky, Marla found herself drawn toward the great bloom in the house's heart. The chamber was vast and impossibly bright, the petals shimmering with translucent gold, veined like stained glass. Inside, Thumbelina lay curled tight, no longer a child, but a radiant and terrible being. Her skin glistened like dew on morning leaves, and her moss-green eyes shone with sorrow and hunger. Mother, the child whispered, voice soft and haunting, the bloom is ready to awaken. Marla reached out, trembling, her fingers brushing the petals that seemed to pulse beneath her touch. The bloom's light washed over her, blurring the edges of the world. The vines tightened their embrace, pulling her deeper into the glow. Her body trembled as the root inside her spread, twisting like living fire beneath her skin. Visions flooded her mind, fields of golden flowers swaying beneath a dark sky, marshes alive with whispers and shadows, and children dancing among the blooms, their eyes shining like stars. The bloom promised eternity, a life beyond the limits of flesh and bone. Her skin grew paler, almost translucent, Veins darkened beneath the surface like rivers of ink. Her fingers lengthened and curled, delicate and sharp like thorns. Her hair faded to shimmering strands of green light, and her eyes gleamed with an unearthly glow. The hunger inside her no longer tormented but guided, a fierce flame that burned with purpose. She was becoming part of the house, part of the marsh, part of the bloom. Days passed in a haze of light and whispers. The house grew brighter, its walls adorned with blossoms that shone like lanterns in the dark. The vines wove a tapestry of green and gold, pulsing with ancient life. Marla walked the halls no longer as a prisoner, but as queen. Her footsteps soft on mossy floors, her voice joining the chorus of the ancient song. The bloom's promise was clear: life beyond death, beauty born from decay, and a hunger that would never be sated but would feed forever. On a night heavy with stars, Marla stood once more before the great bloom. Thumbelina's gaze met hers, filled with sorrow and hope intertwined. "Mother," the child said softly, "soon the world will remember us." The vine stirred, the house exhaled like the sigh of 1,000 years, and Marla smiled. The root inside her pulsed with new strength. The bloom's promise was hers. Outside, the marsh waited, still and endless, its surface shimmering with the light of 1,000 stars. The seed had grown, and its roots reached far beyond the walls of the house. The chill of the early morning seeped through the cracks in the ancient walls, and the marsh outside lay cloaked in a thick, ghostly fog. The house breathed around Marla, alive in every creak and sigh of its wooden bones. The bloom's pulse had become a constant rhythm in her chest, a dark heartbeat that tethered her to the twisted life that now consumed her. She rose from the moss-covered bench where she'd slept fitfully, the weight of exhaustion clinging to her like a shroud. The bruise on her ankle had spread, the dark spirals now etched deep beneath her skin, pulsing faintly with a green light that seemed to emanate from within. The vines, thick and sinewy, wrapped around her legs and arms, their cold touch a cruel reminder that she was no longer free. Marla moved slowly through the shadowed halls, her bare feet silent against the mossy floor. The walls pulsed with life, veins of light running beneath the plaster, and blossoms opened and closed in a hypnotic dance, filling the air with a sweet, heady scent that twisted her stomach. Somewhere deep within the house, she could hear the soft, mournful song of Thumbelina calling to her through the labyrinth of roots and petals. The bloom's glow illuminated the great hall, casting shifting patterns of gold and green across the walls. Marla paused at the threshold, her gaze drawn to the radiant flower at the room's centre. Its petals were vast and shimmering, veined with iridescent light, and at its heart lay Thumbelina, no longer the child she had once cradled, but a radiant, ethereal being, her eyes shimmering with ancient wisdom and unquenchable hunger. "Mother," the child whispered, her voice a melody woven from sorrow and longing. "The bloom is ready to claim you fully." Marla's breath caught in her throat as the vines tightened their grip, pulling her closer to the pulsating heart of the house. She wanted to resist, to flee, but her body betrayed her, drawn inexorably toward the bloom. As she approached, memories flooded her mind, the seed planted in secret, the slow growth of the vines, the transformation that had consumed her and her daughter. Each moment had been a step down a winding path from which there was no return. Yet, beneath the fear and despair, a strange serenity took root within her. The bloom offered a promise, a life beyond the decay, a new form of existence intertwined with the eternal cycles of the marsh. The petals unfurled wider, their edges glowing softly as they reached toward her. The air hummed with power, and Marla felt the tendrils of the bloom brushing against her skin, sending shivers through her veins. The hunger inside her flared, no longer a torment, but a guiding flame. "Come," Thumbelina urged, reaching out with hands that glowed faintly in the dim light. "Join me in the root, Mother. Become part of the promise." Marla hesitated, the last vestiges of her former self resisting the pull. But the bloom's light was overwhelming, a tidal force that swept away doubt and fear. She stepped forward, her body enveloped in the warm glow as the petals closed gently around her. Inside the bloom, time lost meaning. Marla felt herself dissolve and reform, her senses merging with the pulsating life around her. She was the root and the flower, the earth and the sky. Her mind expanded, touching the memories of those who had come before, ancient women and children who had given themselves to the bloom, becoming part of its eternal song. She saw the marsh alive with dancing figures, pale and radiant, their eyes gleaming with the light of stars. They sang in a language older than words, their voices rising in harmony with the rustling reeds and the croaking toads. Marla's form shifted, her skin shimmering with iridescence as tendrils of green light wove through her veins. Her hair flowed like liquid emerald, and her eyes sparkled with the wisdom of ages. She was no longer a woman, but a vessel of the bloom's power, a guardian of the marsh's dark secrets. Yet beneath the transformation, a flicker of human emotion remained, sorrow for the life she had lost, hope for the future her daughter and she would build together. Outside the bloom, the house pulsed with renewed vigour. The vines stretched outward, breaking through walls and windows, reaching toward the marsh beyond. The scent of flowers and earth grew stronger, filling the air with an intoxicating fragrance. promised both life and death. The villagers, long weary of the house, whispered rumours of strange lights and haunting songs drifting across the marsh at night. Some said the house was cursed, others believed it was a gateway to another realm. Marla, now entwined with the bloom, watched as the world changed around her. The marsh began to stir with new life, flowers blooming in impossible colours, trees bending in reverence, and creatures emerging from the shadows to dance beneath the moonlight. The root's promise was spreading, a slow and steady reclaiming of the land. In the depths of the house, Thumbelina smiled, her gaze filled with pride and longing. Together, mother and daughter had become something greater than human, bound forever to the marsh and the bloom. Their song echoed through the night, a haunting lullaby for the lost and the living alike. And the marsh waited, patient and eternal, for the next seed to fall. The first light of dawn seeped slowly over the marsh, stretching like a pale, trembling hand across the mist that clung to the water's surface. The world outside the ancient house remained calm, serene, untouched by the slow, relentless change that pulsed beneath the rotting timbers and the heavy, curling vines. But inside, the house throbbed with a life all its own, alive, breathing, rooted in the deep earth, like some ancient beast waiting patiently for the moment to rise. Marla stood at the centre of the great chamber, bathed in the eerie glow of the massive bloom that had consumed the house's heart. Her skin was translucent and shimmering, like dew-wet leaves caught in the morning sun. Her eyes, once clouded with fear and confusion, now shone with a soft, radiant light, both tender and terrible. She was no longer merely human, but a vessel of something far older and deeper, the root that had taken hold in the marsh, the seed that had grown into this terrifying and beautiful thing. Beside her, Thumbelina moved like a shadow made of light, a creature of impossible grace and ancient power. She reached out to touch her mother's cheek, and Marla felt the connection between them hum, a bond woven not just of flesh and blood, but of root and bloom, earth and spirit. The seed's promise endures, Thumbelina whispered, voice both mournful and triumphant. The house had become a cathedral of green and gold, every surface alive with crawling vines and shimmering petals. The walls pulsed softly with light, veins of golden sap coursing through the wood, and plaster tracing patterns that seemed to tell a story older than memory. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and blossom, thick and intoxicating, mingling with the faint, sweet trace of decay. Marla moved slowly through the corridors, her feet barely touching the moss-covered floor. Everywhere, the bloom had spread, flowers unfurling in impossible hues of green and amber, leaves twisting into delicate, thorned filigrees that glittered in the dim light. The house was no longer a home, but a living thing, a vast organism that breathed and pulsed with the slow rhythm of the marsh. She felt the hunger within her, no longer a torment, but a steady, vital flame. It was the hunger of the root, the promise of growth and transformation, and she was its keeper now, the guardian of the bloom's legacy. Outside, the world held its breath. The marsh rippled gently beneath the morning sun, reeds swaying in time with a breeze that carried the faintest notes of song. The villagers, living in the distant hills, spoke in whispers of the strange house at the marsh's edge, of lights that flickered through the mist, and music that floated on the wind in the dead of night. No one dared approach the house now, not since the children began to disappear, drawn by the bloom's song, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Those who vanished were never seen again, swallowed by the marsh's endless embrace, becoming part of the root's growing promise. Marla's thoughts drifted to those lost children, their faces bright with innocence, now transformed into spirits of the marsh, dancing beneath the moon in fields of golden flowers. She felt their laughter echo through the halls, a bittersweet chorus that mingled with the hum of the roots and the whispered song of the bloom. She was no longer alone. The bloom had become her family, her purpose, her eternity. In the heart of the chamber, the great bloom remained open, its petals vast and delicate, veined with shimmering gold. At its centre rested a small hollow, cradling a new seed, fragile and glowing faintly, with the same life that had consumed Marla and Thumbelina. She reached out with trembling hands, touching the seed softly. It pulsed beneath her fingers, warm and alive, a promise of new beginnings and endless cycles. "This is the legacy," she whispered. "The seed will grow again." The vines that wove through the house stirred, sending tendrils outward through walls and windows, reaching toward the marsh beyond. The earth beneath trembled softly, responding to the root's call. The bloom's influence spread, slow and unstoppable, a reclaiming of the land and all who walked upon it. Far beyond the house, a child wandered near the marsh's edge, drawn by the haunting glow and the gentle, irresistible melody that drifted on the breeze. Her eyes were wide with wonder and innocence, untouched by fear. The soft rustle of leaves and the scent of blossoms beckoned her forward. As she reached through the brambles, a tiny seed slipped from the vine, nestling softly into her palm. The seed shimmered with a golden light, warm and alive. Marla's heart swelled with bittersweet hope. The cycle was unbroken. The bloom's promise endured across time, carried by those willing to listen to the song of the root beneath their feet. The marsh whispered its ancient lullaby, waiting patiently for the next seed to fall. And when it did, the story would begin again.